Hi everyone. Welcome to our virtual coffee hour for November. And thanks for being here. Today we have Dr. Stephanie Bones. She's an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven. And her 2022 ASR article, Femininity Anchors Heterosexual Relationships and Pregnancy as Sites of Harassment for U.S. Servicewomen, received an honorable mention from Peace, War, and Social Conflicts for Peace, War, and Social Conflicts Outstanding Article Award this year. And today she will discuss her forthcoming book, Hardship Duty, Women's Experiences with Sexual Harassment, Sexual Assault, and Discrimination in the U.S. Military. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Dr. Stephanie Bones. Without further ado, I'd like to invite you to begin.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the Peace, War, and Social Conflicts section for putting this event on and all the hard work that you've done to ensure that I'm here today. So I appreciate that. I'm really excited to talk about my book, Hardship Duty, which is coming out in December of this year with Oxford University Press. The book uses 50 interviews with U.S. servicewomen, and I triangulate that with a couple of observations of military courts-martial that I observed in 2016 and 2017 to unpack women's experiences with workplace harassment, sexual assault, and discrimination. So these issues we know are not new, right? These issues have long made headlines in the United States news reports. I think it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that an Army doctor was charged with sexually assaulting at least 39 other soldiers, which is now being described as one of the largest sexual assault cases in military history in this country. But every single military branch has been implicated in these issues of harassment and assault. And this is something that I think the Department of Defense understands. They collect a lot of data on this, on sexual assault in the organization across branches. And the most recent report found an increase in estimated sexual assault incidents at 8.4% of individuals experiencing sexual violence, compared to 6.2% in 2018 and 4.3% in 2016. And maybe some people might be thinking, oh, this might be good news that more people are reporting. Sadly, this measure is of estimated incidents, and they also have a measure that looks at estimated reporting, which they argue is down. So this is not reflecting the number of actual reports. So in the 2023 report, there was an estimated 1 in 5 victims were reporting their sexual assaults, compared to 1 in 3 in 2018 and 1 in 3 in 2016. So incidence is up and reporting is down. They also collect some measures on attitudes, and they are arguing that in 2021 was the lowest confidence level that individuals had that the military would do something in the event that they were sexually assaulted. So confidence is low that the military will handle cases appropriately. So this shows a little bit of the scope of the problem as outlined by the Department of Defense itself. So sexual violence is happening at high rates. Few people are reporting, and this vulnerability has been sustained despite what I would say are widespread and longstanding prevention efforts. The Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program was established in 2005. This is responsible for the oversight of sexual assault policy across the DoD. In the last almost 20 years, we're seeing things like victim advocates, both uniformed and civilian, appear. We're seeing special lawyers designed to assist victims through the military criminal justice system. We're seeing programs like Catch a Repeat Offender, where you can report someone without having to trigger a legal response in order to make sure that somebody can't harm somebody else. And this is where my book focuses, on this precise puzzle of how is sexual violence remaining so highly prevalent in an organization that has long-standing and evolving and adaptive policies, prevention strategies, and education programs that are designed to address sexual violence. In the book, I acknowledge the role of structure, cultural, and organizational context. And I look at the ways in which those things contribute to sexual harassment and sexual violence vulnerability, which I argue is absent in a lot of the policies that the military adopts. The typical response to military sexual abuse is to focus on the individual level And by that, I mean that the military will respond to a problem related to sexual violence or a new instance of a wave of harassment they're experiencing by maybe making a policy that targets individual perpetrators. For example, most recently, or one of the most recent examples is there was a big push to codify sexual harassment as a standalone crime in the Uniform Code of Military Justice in response to a statistic that arose that sexual harassment in a unit leads to an enhanced likelihood for sexual violence in that unit. And so that's really designed to then, prosecute sexual harassment against individual perpetrators. They will respond with developing more programs for individual victims. But what my book reveals and the interviews with servicewomen reveal is that so many people who experience victimization are not ending up talking to a victim advocate. They're not ending up in the JAG's office talking to a lawyer about their case. They're not reporting. And so these individual level solutions and policies are not doing much to stop these victimizations, and it's not doing much to enable access to victims to these reporting streams, even though the policies and reporting streams are comprehensive and what I would argue are good policies. So my research takes a different approach and explains how the military as an institution, rather than individuals within it, facilitates sexual harassment and violence vulnerability. And therefore, the policy recommendations that I make at the conclusion of my book are focused on the interactional and structural levels. So the first chapter looks at femininity in the broader military setting. I argue that femininity is actively devalued and denigrated at multiple points in the military, and that women are objectified at multiple points in the military. This, of course, occurs at that interactional level, right? The interpersonal relationships between two people. However, it is informed by the values and the ideals that the military as an institution is celebrating and promoting. And so I argue that the military promotes this idea of an ideal service member, which is actually layered and promoting an aggressive warrior masculinity, but at the same time, valuing things that are not feminine. So a part of devaluing femininity is an essential aspect of enacting brotherhood, of enacting and of constructing what it means to be an ideal service member. It's not just promoting aggressive masculinity, but there's a key component of devaluing femininity, which of course creates a tension for women, say in the Marine Corps, who are women and trying to be a good Marine. The way that this plays out interactionally, of course, and these things are not limited to the military. This happens all over our society. But let's say in training, people are teasing a serviceman or a trainee and calling him a girl or a pussy or a female, right? So using these feminized labels to devalue that person, to maybe emasculate him, to make him work harder. But the underlying assumption here is that women are weaker. And really, this also shapes how women are treated, right? They are perpetual outsiders. Sexual objectification is also quite common, where things like songs or jokes or nicknames in the military often are sites of objectification for women. It is within this context that all service members are trying to establish themselves and do their own identity work to be seen as good service members. But this becomes really hard for women since they're almost always automatically associated with femininity, even when they perform aspects of masculinity or do that masculine identity work, as Weston Zimmerman would say. It's often read and coded and received as feminine and then inherently bad. So if a woman is displaying an aggression, for example, she might be labeled a bitch rather than being seen as appropriately masculine. And this is what Mimi Shippers calls our pariah femininities. And the ones that women in the military talk about maneuvering between are trying to avoid being called a slut or a bitch. So I argue that this femophobic interactional context actually can help us predict when harassment will be elevated. And this is the subject of my ASR paper that won the honorable mention from the section. And I look at when women are perceived to be more feminine or when they are tied to femininity through femininity anchors, such as pregnancy or when heterosexual relationships they're in are revealed to the unit, they're actually tethered to a feminine identity in a context that devalues femininity, or that is what Hoshkin would call femophobic. And therefore, because they're tied to that identity, they actually experience elevated levels of harassment and harassment from more perpetrators. So there is something going on about the institutional values of and meanings around femininity and individual harassment experiences. They are inherently tied together. So then the rest of the chapters of the book, so chapter 3 and 4 and 5, look and trace how this femophobic context, this misogyny, and the prioritization of a warrior aggressive masculinity actually permeates the organization's geography and its spatial arrangements. And this impacts the women's work, social, and home lives, because many installations are comprised of all three of these components of people's lives. And then I also show how femophobia seeps into the military's administrative policies and bureaucracy, so that policies become tools of harm rather than resources for victims, even as they're intended to be resources for victims. The later chapters of the book, the last chapter looks at how women respond to this treatment. So I draw on 50 interviews with U.S. servicewomen across 4 branches of the military. And I conducted these interviews from 2014 to 2019 at a time when the military, at least on paper and policy-wise, was becoming more progressive and had more equality in mind. We see the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010. The ban on women in combat is lifted in 2013. So we're seeing more and more progressive policies. So I wanted to capture women who had served at a time when that was the case. While the military hires a large number of women, it is still dominated by men over the DoD. This is a little bit old, but the numbers are similar. This is from 2021. You can see that around 17% of the DoD is comprised of women. This, of course, varies by branch, with the Air Force having the most representation of women at 21.1%, and the Marine Corps having the least at 8.9%. So I'm going to focus now on this chapter, chapter 3, not safe at work, not safe at home, sexual vulnerability in military spaces, because I want to show you what it's like to be one of those, small percentage of women living on these bases. So, and space matters in 3 main ways. What values, messages, and imagery dominates the culture, and what values, messages, and imagery ends up embedded in physical space around you. By that, I mean, what our office is decorated with. What are you reading on flyers when you go to the bathroom? What's written on the table when you sit down for lunch? What posters are people hanging up in their offices or in their rooms? So what messages are in the space? Who dominates the space in terms of sheer numbers? Okay, we know men do from that last slide. And then who dominates the space in terms of power rank hierarchy? And what do those people who are in control and who have power in the space think, and how do they act when it comes to sexual violence vulnerability? So when I visited military installations, I saw masculine and hypersexual imagery in military workplaces, outside of courtrooms, in lunch, in cafeterias or restaurants, coffee shops, grocery stores, and bathrooms. But the most striking example that I myself did not see, that many of my participants talked about, was the presence of pornography in military spaces. And this is despite official rules against pornography at work. Women described pornographic images, mostly naked women, that were in places like bathrooms, cockpits, lockers, tents, bedrooms, and offices, as well as online spaces. They would receive imagery through their DMs and social media or through email, which again is prohibited in the military workplace. So Rebecca was enlisted in the Marine Corps. At the time when she was enlisted, the Marine Corps was only 6% women. And she explained that there was only one bathroom in her office and it was plastered with porn. And she said, whoa, okay, they're testing me. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to go back to my little shack and not say anything. I want out of this place. Interestingly, when Rebecca worked in this unit, she attended a training that highlighted the fact that pornography was banned in public spaces and it had no place in the workplace. And she did not interpret this training as, oh, great, this means that I have an avenue to report. She interpreted this training and the men around her who also sat through its reaction that they knew that this was banned, that this was against policy, and that they were okay with it and going to continue to put pornographic images in the bathroom. And so she interpreted this as a layer of her, I'm not safe here, even to talk about this. In my research, I saw a publicly available Facebook page where a servicewoman shared a photo of a farewell gift for one of the men that was rotating out of her unit received. And the caption read, this is the picture of it. I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but it read, here's to honor, getting on her, hitting on her, and if you can't come in her, come on her. So messages like this that I would argue are hypersexual, violent, and objectifying women and misogynistic, when they're embedded in something like a physical plaque at a celebration event, what messages is that sending to everyone in the unit? And then I have to ask the question, where is this going to go? Is this person going to go to their next unit and hang it up in their office? What are junior ranking people who are going into that office? What messages are they getting about what the military values and thinks about women when this is put on an official military plaque? So that's how misogyny can become embedded in physical space. This is what it's like for, this is again a woman in the Marine Corps. This is what it's like for women who, when you are one of the only women on a military base. June describes a context where she was one of the only women in her barracks and that men would show up to her door and ask her out. 10 guys who come to your door every day and ask you out. And I said, is that common? People knock on your door and ask you out? Oh, definitely, all the time. People you've never seen before, and they know that the girl lives here or whatever. As one of the only women in the barracks, her location and her room were known to servicemen that she had never met. She said men would congregate outside her door and whisper and dare each other to knock. Some would knock and run away. And she said, and some would, legitimately asked her out, to the point where she developed a strategy where she pretended to be religious and said, sure, do you want to go on a church date? That was the way she avoided this, avoided being called a slut for basically going out with these individuals once they asked her out. But for June and for other women, and I'm going to quote another woman here, it's really difficult because you live and you work and you socialize oftentimes if you're enlisted in the same place. And so here's a case of Margaret, who said she was teased and harassed a lot at work. And she said, and it's not like in the civilian world where if you have a problem, you leave it at work. There's no leave it at work because it's all work. And so she said that if she had a civilian job and these guys were bothering her at work, she could at least go home and watch TV and forget about it. But she wasn't able to do that. She said she would often sit in her room and think about like, oh, do I really want to leave my room right now and like face those guys again? Because they would be there, at the smoke pit or at the gym where she was working out. She risked seeing them, not just at work. So there was really no safe space. This next quote I'm going to analyze, and I'm going to talk a little bit about control of space. This is in my barracks room. I was having someone was trying to break in at night, and he very clearly knew that I was in there. You couldn't lock the door permanently. I tried to get someone to fix it. I asked someone, what can we do? And he said, why don't you get a bat? And I ended up setting up my own alarm with spoons. They had no interest in fixing it. I think they said, we don't have money to fix it, so I set up the spoons. So Samantha is not unique. Several women in my sample described men breaking into either their barracks room, their hotel rooms, or their deployment spaces and trying to sexually assault them. Some of these people had keys to their room without their knowledge. Others climbed in through windows that were broken. Some tried to break the lock on a door. And in one case, someone tried to pound down the door. So this was a pervasive security issue related to military physical spaces that the women had to rely on the military to address, because they were living or working in a military space. So if Samantha had lived off of the military base, she could have called her landlord, or she could have fixed the lock herself. But she has to go through a military person to address this problem. And that person did not value or see sexual vulnerability as an issue. And so we need to think about who controls space and what kind of maintenance decisions are they going to prioritize? If they're not thinking about sexual violence vulnerability and not taking it seriously, there's going to be more safety issues for women. When women try to advocate for themselves, they're often shut down. Melanie argued, a bunch of women in Melanie's unit were assigned to change of quarters duty, where they basically sit with someone else and try to make sure nothing goes wrong, where the military police are going to be called to the barracks. And her concern along with other women is that if we're going to do this, we want them to be the same gender. And she said, we went to our NCOs, they blew us off. We went to the SHARP representative, who's supposed to be the one that handles sexual assault. He blew us off and just didn't care. Several females expressed the concerns about being with a male on duty at night in the barracks, and everybody just ignored us. So women's attempts to make spaces safer can be thwarted by men in positions of power who downplay and ignore sexual violence vulnerability. And I'm going to show through Nadine's example of how this can really culminate in feeling left alone and to your own devices when you experience these victimizations. So Nadine was almost raped in her bed while deployed to Iraq. She says, "We just finished doing this really long run and I came back and the air conditioner was out in my can." That's what we called them because it was an aluminum box essentially. So I had my window open and the next thing I know, someone had crawled in my window and I knew who it was. It was a master gunnery sergeant. And I was like, what the? And I remember I hand over my mouth and I was able to fight him off, but like no one would have believed me. I don't think anybody would have believed me. So I try not to think about that. I try not to think about anything else that happened. So in this instance, Nadine was almost raped in her bed while deployed in Iraq, and she fought this guy off. But after that moment, she told herself, I've got to go on every single convoy. I'm not going to be left back here. And she signed up to leave base whenever possible, meaning that she would rather risk the dangers of a convoy, potential enemy fire, potential combat situations than face the dangers of the men that were deployed with her and were supposed to be acting as her brothers. She said that she's also started going back to the gym, working out, trying to get stronger and trying to get her martial arts training back because it wasn't an issue of me figuring out the right people to trust. And I think that's what upset me the most. It wasn't so much me not following my better judgment. It's just I can't worry about everyone all the time. So this shows how for women, managing sexual violence vulnerability takes a lot of vigilance. And because if the institution's not handling it, if other service members aren't checking each other or challenging each other on things like harassment, it becomes the job becomes that of women's to monitor all situations, and it's very tiring. This also highlights how she knew she was alone. If we take Melanie's example from before, trying to advocate for sexual safety didn't go anywhere for her. Nadine knew she was alone in this experience, and she knew that people weren't going to take it seriously. She even says, no one would have believed me. I will highlight this with one final quote that says that this is taught to people by how people respond when you do complain or do respond and report sexual violence. There is a woman who said, I've had situations where I was 40,000 feet altitude and I'm flying with two pilots for an international flight, and one of them puts his hand on my knee. There's nothing you can do except remove his hand and pretend like it didn't happen, because unfortunately the culture is, if you're one of the few women who says anything, you're labeled as the person who's going to call sexual harassment. So there becomes the blame is placed on victims. There's a culture of silencing victims, which I think is directly linked to this disdain of femininity and this disdain of women that permeates many of the military values. The last quote I'm going to analyze, I do want to get to the Q&A, highlights some of the other chapters of my book, as well as the spatial features. This comes from Kay, and her quote opens the first chapter of my book. I was running around base, and one of the guys I know from my command pulled up next to me in his car. I didn't know him really well, but he was always nice, kind of quiet. He said, "You need a ride?" I was like, "Yeah." So he gave me a ride, and we ended up not going to my barracks. I was like, "Where are we going?" He took me to this pier over on the other side of the base, and he attacked me in his car. He turned his car off, and he just attacked me. It was a nightmare. It was dark, and he attacked me. He tried to rape me. I ended up running out the car and getting away from him and catching the little shuttle and going back to my barracks and crying. I remember I was like, forget this. And I had this number from my therapist, and I said, I'm very depressed. I want to hurt myself. They took me to a mental hospital, and I was there for like a week with crazy people who were detoxing from drugs. When I got out, they put me back into my regular command. Nobody knew what happened, supposedly. I reported what happened when I got back to my command. And he, her attacker, actually came up to the window where I worked one day, and he just stood there and he said, "How are you doing?" And I just wanted to burn his face off. Come to find out, I reported it, they investigated it, and it was his word against mine. And because I was technically crazy, they didn't believe me. Then when I went to get out of the Navy, I had got this personality code that said I had a personality disorder. So in this example, this highlights again the spatial arrangements, that she doesn't have a car. She needs to rely on military transportation or rides from people who she knows, like she was an acquaintance with this person who offers to drive her to her barracks. It's also easier to be alerted to daily routines when you work in the same office and live near that person as well. So that shows how she was vulnerable. It's also clear that Kay was suffering from the experience of an attempted rape. Yet her institutionalization is used to question her credibility as a witness and to dismiss her sexual assault case rather than as evidence that she experienced a real trauma. If victim policies worked the way they were designed to, Kay would not be treated as someone who's not trustworthy. The documentation of the institutionalization would not be used against her, but rather to help her build her case, her sexual assault or her attempted rape case. Kay also brings up this idea of having a personality disorder code. In the military, a personality disorder is considered a pre-existing condition, which, if you are labeled as having one, can be used to sever your post service benefits, things like GI Bill, things like medical benefits, things like mental health assistance that can help you process the trauma of an attempted rape, things that people join the military to receive, right? So having this personality code just registered to her, disorder code registered to her, meant that she was going to be ineligible for all of those benefits. She's not unique in this. Actually, the Committee on Veterans Affairs has accused the Department of Defense of improper use of personality disorder codes to medically separate service members to avoid paying for those post-service benefit costs. So this also shows how the military blames victims. So overall, in the book, I argue that the commonplace femophobia and devaluation and objectification of women creates a deprioritization of sexual assault, where men don't support or believe women about assault, why they do not prioritize sexual safety in their physical spaces, or why they might want to use a policy to silence a victim rather than to help them. So yes, people are making individual decisions that might worsen someone's vulnerability to sexual violence, but we need to really change and challenge the femophobic culture rather than which will then encourage people to mitigate this vulnerability. The military prides itself on being able to retrain people to break them down and rebuild them as a soldier, a Marine, right, an airman. And in the process, it should try not to rebuild them as femophobic and misogynistic. It could train them to value equality of service members, as well as to frame sexual violence as a threat to an effective military force, right? And therefore, individuals could learn to then assess situations, assignments, and issues through a way that enhances sexual safety as a key aspect of their job, right? The military also has this unique system where people have to be there, usually contractually obligated for 4 years, and it can separate people and kick them out for failing to adhere to like their orders or a good order, to fail to adhere to orders or the laws that they set out in UCMJ. And instead, what we see is that the culture is seeping into the way the policies are viewed and implemented and controlled, and they're being used as a way to punish victims rather than to ensure sexual safety in the organization, despite its wonderful and comprehensive policies aimed at addressing this issue. So that is all I'll say before the Q&A, and I just wanted to throw up a little slide here with some of the people who have read the book already, and there's a QR code if you would like to purchase the book.
Thank you, Dr. Bones. That was a very interesting discussion, very incisive research, and difficult but critical topic. So I was personally very curious, and I'm glad that you were able to join us today. I'm gonna pause the recording now.
Okay.
So that we can